The officer's hand connected with the stack of files before anyone could react, papers exploding across the hallway floor like a burst of white confetti while the whole ward went dead silent. Nurse Evelyn Hart stood there, 31 years old, 5'4", with her arms at her sides and her jaw tight, watching Officer Brock Mercer laugh at the mess he'd just made of her morning. "Move before I move you myself," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Nobody stepped in. Nobody said a word. What Brock Mercer didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman he'd just shoved aside had once kept 3 soldiers alive in a collapsed building while artillery fell 200 meters away. And she remembered every face that looked away. If this story is pulling you in already, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. Hargrove Regional Medical Center sat on the eastern edge of Caldwell City, a mid-sized industrial town that had spent the last decade trying to convince itself it was more than a refinery town with a hospital. The building was old enough to have original tile in the trauma bays and new enough to have a glossy administrative wing added on after the 2018 renovation, the kind of addition that looked impressive from the parking lot and meant nothing to the nurses who spent 12-hour shifts on their feet. Evelyn Hart had worked the overnight into morning shift on the third-floor surgical recovery unit for the past 14 months. She was not the loudest nurse on staff, not the one who organized birthday cakes in the break room or complained about parking at the weekly huddles. She did her job. She did it well. She went home, slept 4 hours, ran 4 miles, and came back. The other nurses liked her well enough, or at least respected her in the way people respect someone who never drops a task and never asks for help. Charge nurse Dottie Farwell, who had been running that floor for 11 years and had the posture of a woman who'd carried too much for too long, once told a new hire, "Watch how Evelyn moves. That girl has a system, and it works." That morning had started like any other. 6:40 a.m., the overlap period where night shift handed off to days, clipboards changing hands, voices low, the particular fatigue of people who had been awake too long, passing information to people who hadn't quite woken up yet. Evelyn was standing at the nurse's station, reviewing overnight vitals on a patient in room 312, when the elevator at the end of the corridor opened and Officer Brock Mercer walked out like he owned the floor. She'd seen him before. Most of the staff had. Brock was the kind of cop who treated the hospital the way some people treat a hotel they're not paying for, with casual entitlement and the low-grade aggression of someone who expected accommodation. He came in maybe once a week, usually following up on someone in custody who'd been admitted, occasionally just wandering through. Nobody challenged him because his brother-in-law was on the hospital board and everyone knew it. He was 44, heavy-set, with the kind of broad shoulders that had probably been impressive 15 years ago and now just made him seem difficult to get around. He had a way of taking up space that wasn't about his size. It was deliberate. Planted feet, head up, the physical language of someone who had decided a long time ago that the world would move for him. He was heading toward room 308, where a custody patient had been placed following a DUI incident the night before. And Evelyn happened to be coming the other way with a med cart stacked with the morning's distribution. The hallway wasn't narrow. There was room. Brock didn't adjust his path. She moved the cart slightly to the right. He kept coming. She angled further. His shoulder caught the edge of her clipboard, and the whole stack she'd been holding, vital sheets, the overnight chart notes, 2 consent forms she'd spent 20 minutes organizing, but went off the side of the cart and spread across the linoleum in a wide fan of paper. She bent to pick them up. "Excuse you," Brock said, not stopping. She looked up. "It's fine." He stopped then, turned around, slow, the way people do when they've decided to make something into a performance. 2 other nurses at the station looked up. An aide pushing a linen cart at the far end of the hall stopped moving. "You ran into me," he said. Evelyn stayed crouched, gathering papers. "I didn't, but it's not a big deal." "It is when you make a mess in the middle of the hallway." She stood up, met his eyes, said nothing. That was the mistake, not the silence itself, the steadiness behind it. Brock Mercer was a man who expected one of 2 responses from women he talked down to, apology or upset. Either one gave him something to work with. Evelyn's expression gave him nothing, and that absence read to him as challenge. He stepped closer. Not threatening in a legal sense, just enough to invade the space that common decency assigned her. "You know what your problem is," he said. "You people think because you wear scrubs, you've got authority. You don't. You push paper and take temperatures. That's it. You people." The phrase landed in the hallway and nobody reacted to it out loud. But Evelyn heard it, and she could see from the drop in Dottie Farwell's shoulders at the station that Dottie had heard it too. "I have patients to get to," Evelyn said. "Then get to them." He reached out and shoved the med cart sideways. Just a push, just enough to be undeniable, not enough that he couldn't later claim it was accidental. And the remaining papers on top slid to the floor again. He looked at them, looked at her, and laughed. Short, dismissive. "Move before I move you myself," he said, and walked past her toward 308. The hallway was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then Dottie said, quietly, "You okay?" Evelyn was already picking up the papers again. "Fine." Her voice was steady. Her hands were steady, but something behind her eyes had gone very still in the way that water goes still before it freezes. "I'm going to document that," Dottie said. "Document what you saw," Evelyn said. "Don't editorialize." The formal complaint went in that afternoon. Evelyn filed it through the hospital's internal reporting system, a digital form that went to HR, to the patient safety officer, and to the office of the chief operating officer, a man named Gerald Putnam, who had been in healthcare administration for 26 years and had the political instincts of someone who had survived that long by never picking the wrong side of a fight. Putnam read the complaint at 2:15 p.m. By 2:45, his assistant had called Brock Mercer's supervisor at the 14th Precinct, not to report the incident, but to apologize for any inconvenience caused by a staffing misunderstanding. By 3:30, Putnam had called Dottie Farwell into his office and asked her, with the careful language of someone who understood liability, whether she was entirely certain of what she'd witnessed. Dottie was certain. She said so. Putnam thanked her and told her the matter was being reviewed appropriately. Evelyn found out what reviewed appropriately meant. The next morning, when she was called into a meeting with HR Director Pamela Voss, a woman who dressed expensively and smiled the way people smile when they've already decided the outcome of a conversation. "We want to be very clear," Pamela said, "that we take all employee concerns seriously." There was a folder on the desk. Evelyn recognized the format, a performance improvement record. Her name was on the tab. "That's new," Evelyn said, nodding at the folder. "It came to our attention," Pamela said, "following a review of recent incidents, that there have been some concerns about interpersonal communication on your unit. I filed a complaint about Officer Mercer, not about communication. We've spoken with Officer Mercer and with several staff members. The general picture that emerged suggested a pattern of, let's say, friction." "Friction." Evelyn kept her voice flat. "I want to be honest with you, Evelyn, because I think you're a talented nurse and we'd hate to lose you." Pamela folded her hands. "The officer's family has significant ties to this institution, and the reality of healthcare administration is that we have to balance—" "I know what you're doing," Evelyn said. Pamela paused. "You're building a paper trail to make termination look performance-based." Evelyn looked at the folder. "What's in it?" "This is a preliminary. What specific incidents are cited?" A beat of silence. "There's a note from Dr. Rafferty about a medication protocol disagreement in November. I flagged a dosing error. That was documented and the patient was protected. And a note from a colleague about communication style during—" "Which colleague?" Pamela's smile tightened. "We keep those anonymous to protect—" "Right." Evelyn stood up. "I want a copy of that file. We're not at the stage where I'm entitled to any documentation that contains my name under this hospital's own HR policy. I'd like a copy. Today." She looked at Pamela with the same stillness she'd shown Brock in the hallway, that same nothing to work with steadiness. "I'll wait." She got the copy. She took it home and read every word of it twice. Then she photographed each page on her phone, uploaded it to a secure folder, and sent a message to a person whose number she'd kept saved under the name R. Calloway. Logistics for 3 years without needing it. The message was short. They're moving on me. Starting documentation. The reply came in 4 minutes. Understood. Sit tight. Don't escalate yet. She set the phone down and made coffee and didn't think about what it meant that yet was in that message. Over the following week, the pressure was consistent and quiet, the way sustained institutional pressure almost always is. Her schedule was adjusted without consultation, placing her on a floating assignment rotation that made continuity of patient care difficult. 2 of her regular co-workers stopped eating lunch with her, not dramatically, just gradually, the way people drift when they've sensed which way the current is moving. She was assigned to cover a unit she hadn't worked in 8 months and given no orientation overlap. Brock Mercer came through the floor twice that week. The first time, he didn't acknowledge her. The second time, he stopped at the station while she was charting and said, to no one in particular, "Still here, huh?" and walked on. She kept charting. On the 8th day, Putnam called her in directly. No HR present, which told her everything about how confident he felt in the legal positioning. "I'm going to be direct with you," he said. He was a lean man, 60-something, with silver hair and the kind of careful wardrobe that signaled he had once cared a great deal about being taken seriously. "The environment has become complicated. I think we both know that." "I filed a legitimate complaint," Evelyn said, "and it was reviewed." He pressed his palms flat on the desk, a gesture of finality dressed up as openness. "What I'm offering you is a transition package. 4 weeks of pay, a positive reference letter, and a mutual non-disclosure agreement. It's a fair offer, given the circumstances." She looked at him. "What circumstances?" He met her eyes for a moment, then looked at his hands. Sometimes institutional relationships require difficult decisions. That's the reality of this environment. "I want to understand something," Evelyn said slowly. "You're asking me to sign an NDA in exchange for leaving quietly after an officer physically disrupted my workspace and made a racially loaded comment in front of multiple witnesses. I wouldn't characterize it as, I know you wouldn't." She leaned forward slightly. "I'm not signing anything, and I'm not leaving quietly." Putnam's expression shifted into something practiced and cool. "I'd encourage you to think carefully about what a prolonged process might look like." "I encourage the same," she said, and left. She did not get another shift assignment after that meeting. The following Monday, the badge reader outside the 3rd floor unit didn't accept her credentials. She went to security, was told there was a system update, was asked to wait in the lobby. After 40 minutes, Pamela Voss appeared with a folder and a building security officer standing slightly behind her like punctuation. "We're placing you on administrative leave," Pamela said. "Effective today. You'll be escorted to collect personal belongings." Evelyn looked at the security officer, looked at Pamela. She was aware of the lobby desk staff watching, of 2 nurses from the 2nd floor who'd come down to check the pharmacy window and had stopped when they saw what was happening. She said, "This is retaliation for a protected complaint. This is a standard administrative process. It's retaliation, and everyone in this lobby just heard me say that." They walked her to the 3rd floor. She took 11 minutes to collect her things. Dottie Farwell was at the nurse's station when she came through and stood up when she saw Evelyn with the security escort and a cardboard box. "Evelyn, document everything you see, Dottie." She kept moving. Date, time, witnesses, everything. She rode the elevator down with a security guard who was 24 and clearly wished he was anywhere else. In the lobby, she signed for the temporary keycard surrender, took the receipt, and walked out into the March morning air carrying a box with her stethoscope, 3 protein bars, a spare pair of scrubs, and a framed photo of nothing. Just a landscape print she'd bought at a craft fair and put on her locker shelf because the color was nice. She sat in her car for 2 minutes. Then she took out her phone and typed a longer message this time. "They moved. I'm out of the building. What do you need from me?" The response came in 90 seconds, and it wasn't from the person she'd messaged. It was from a number she didn't recognize, and it said, "Nothing yet. But we may need you sooner than expected. Stay available." She stared at the message for a moment. Then she started the car, calm. The Hargrove Linden chemical plant sat 7 miles northeast of the hospital, On the industrial corridor that had been there since the 1960s, adjacent to the rail yard and the kind of neighborhood that had stopped expecting good news somewhere around 2004, the plant processed industrial solvents and maintained a moderate safety record, meaning it had never had a catastrophic incident on record, only near misses that got quietly entered into reports nobody read. At 11:47 a.m. on Thursday, 4 days after Evelyn's escort from the building, a pressure failure in storage unit C4 caused a sequential failure in 2 adjacent tanks. The resulting explosion was heard across most of Caldwell City's eastern quarter. It shattered windows 6 blocks away. The initial blast killed 2 workers immediately, injured 11 more in the collapse, and sent a chemical particulate cloud spreading southwest on the morning wind. The first ambulances reached Hargrove Regional at 12:09. By 12:20, they had 12 patients. By 12:35, 23. The injuries were complex: blast trauma, crush injuries, chemical burns, inhalation exposure with a compound that the plant's emergency data sheet hadn't been fully updated to reflect since a 2021 formulation change that nobody outside chemical operations knew about. The trauma bays went from ordered to overwhelmed in under 8 minutes. Dr. Vic Salazar, the attending trauma surgeon on shift, was a solid physician. Good hands, good instincts. But he hadn't run a mass casualty event in 4 years, and the protocols had changed. The charge nurse on trauma was 2 weeks into the rotation from med-surg and had never seen a full-floor MCI. Putnam appeared in the department doorway at 12:31 and stood there looking at the controlled chaos with an expression of administrative dread. "Where's the incident, Commander?" someone yelled. Nobody answered. 3 patients had been triaged as critical. One was deteriorating faster than the workup explained. A firefighter who'd been near the second explosion had blast lung and wasn't moving air the way he should, and nobody had yet caught that the inhalation agent was doing something specific and different from standard smoke exposure because the MSDS they were working from was the old one. The department was not functioning, it was reacting, which is different, and in mass casualty events, the difference kills people. Evelyn was at home 20 minutes away when her phone rang. Not a text this time. A call. The unfamiliar number. She answered. Nurse Hart. A man's voice. Measured, professional, the cadence of someone who did not waste syllables. This is Colonel Darden Foss, USASOC Medical Command. We have a situation. She was already standing up. I saw the news alerts. Hargrove Linden? 26 patients at Hargrove Regional and more coming. Civilian MCI response is failing. We have assets 10 minutes out. We need you on site before we arrive. I've been placed on administrative leave. I'm aware. A brief pause that contained nothing apologetic. That's not a factor from where I'm sitting. She was already moving toward the door with her keys. What's the exposure compound? Methylene isocyanate derivative. The plant's 2021 formulation included a secondary binding agent the MSDS doesn't reflect. We have the updated data sheet. Send it to my phone. I'll read it on the way. Already sent. 12 minutes, Nurse Hart. I'll be there in 9. She was there in 8. The trauma bay doors opened and Evelyn walked in carrying nothing but her phone and wearing civilian clothes, dark jeans, a gray pullover. And for a second, the chaos didn't even register her because she looked like nobody that anyone expected. And then Dr. Salazar looked up from a patient and recognized her, and his expression crossed through surprise and relief and confusion all at once. Hart? You can't be here. They said, who's your critical? She was already moving. Bay 3, blast lung, not moving air. Is he on the old MSDS protocol? Salazar stopped. The what? She was already at Bay 3. The firefighter, late 40s, broad-shouldered, was working hard for every breath, and the monitor showed what should have been a standard presentation, except it wasn't. She looked at the chart, looked at the interventions documented, looked at him. You need to stop the bronchodilator, she said to the nurse at the bedside. The nurse looked at Salazar. Salazar hesitated for exactly 1 second, then nodded. The compound he inhaled has a secondary agent that bronchodilators potentiate. He needs a different pathway. She looked at Salazar. Do you have the formulary for CDMB inhalation protocol? I don't know what. It was just sent to your system from USASOC Medical. Check your terminal. He checked. It was there. He looked at her with an expression she had seen before. The particular look of a competent person encountering information that rearranged what they thought they knew. And then he started reading and giving orders. The firefighters' numbers began to stabilize inside 4 minutes. Evelyn moved to the next bay. Then, through the ambulance bay doors, through the noise and the radio chatter and the running feet, came a sound that cut through everything else. Not an explosion, not an alarm, a helicopter. Then two. Then the unmistakable percussion of military rotor wash, low and close, the kind that changed the air pressure enough to feel it in your chest. The hospital's rear landing pad lit up, and then the doors opened, and 8 people in tactical medical gear walked into the trauma department in organized formation, and every single one of them was scanning the room. Until they found her. The first medic through the door, a woman, late 20s, sergeant's insignia, tactical vest over her medical kit, stopped when she saw Evelyn in the gray pullover with a patient chart in her hand and came to attention. "Ma'am," she said. The whole formation stopped behind her. Salazar looked up from the terminal. Putnam, who had finally ventured into the department doorway, went very still. The trauma nurses, the aides, even the paramedics who were mid-handoff with new patients, they all registered what had just happened, even if none of them could yet name what they were seeing. And then Colonel Darden Foss walked through the door behind his team, a man who moved like someone the room would rearrange itself around, and he crossed the floor directly to Evelyn Hart and said, clearly enough for everyone present to hear, "Ma'am, we've been waiting for your orders." The room didn't just go quiet. It went a particular kind of quiet that happens when a group of people simultaneously recalibrate something they thought they understood. Gerald Putnam stood in the doorway with his mouth slightly open. Officer Brock Mercer, who had arrived at the hospital 15 minutes earlier under the pretense of checking on an unrelated custody matter, and had been standing near the department entrance watching the chaos with the comfortable detachment of a man who had never expected to be accountable to it, took one step back. Evelyn looked at Colonel Foss. Then she looked at the room, at Salazar, at the nurses, at the patients, at the 3 incoming ambulances she could see through the bay doors, at the 22 people still needing care, and the 8-person military medical team standing ready, and the specific weight of the moment pressing down on all of it. "Foss?" she said, and her voice was the same voice she'd used in the hallway when Brock told her to move. Steady, flat, containing nothing that wanted to be worked with. "Give me your casualty breakdown bay by bay. We have at least one more with CDMB exposure, and I want everyone on the updated protocol before we lose another airway." "Yes, ma'am." He turned to his team, and they moved. Evelyn was already on her way to Base 7. Behind her in the doorway, Gerald Putnam pulled out his phone with hands that weren't entirely steady and stared at the screen without dialing anything. And Brock Mercer, still one step back from where he'd been standing 30 seconds ago, watched a woman he'd shoved aside and laughed at in a hospital hallway give orders to a colonel, and realized, with the particular cold clarity of a man whose luck has just run out, that something had shifted permanently in the architecture of his world. He just didn't know yet how completely. He didn't understand it yet. That was the thing about Brock Mercer that would later seem almost pitiable, if pitiable were a word anyone was inclined to apply to him. He stood one step back from the doorway with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his face doing the slow recalibration of a man who has just seen something he can't immediately categorize. And what he settled on, because it was the only framework that made sense to him, was that this was temporary. A fluke, some kind of protocol confusion where a bunch of military people had gotten the wrong address and were following the wrong nurse around a hospital that was having a bad day. That was the story he told himself for the first 12 minutes. Then he watched Evelyn Hart call a room full of trauma physicians and military medics into a coordinated response that functioned like a surgical instrument, precise, sequential, without wasted motion, and something in the back of his mind began revising the story without his permission. Inside the trauma department, the shift was immediate and structural. The military team moved in 4 pairs, each assigned to a specific bay, each operating on the updated CDMB inhalation protocol that Evelyn had transmitted from her phone to the hospital's clinical system in the car ride over. a 2-page addendum that the plant's emergency coordinator had never sent to Hargrove Regional because the plant's emergency coordinator had been on leave since February and nobody had covered the responsibility. That particular gap would surface later. There were a lot of gaps that would surface later. Evelyn worked the floor with Colonel Foss running adjacent to her, not leading, not deferring, but operating in the specific professional partnership of two people who had worked emergencies before and understood that ego was a luxury nobody could afford when the clock was running. She called triage, he provided personnel. She adjusted treatment pathways his team implemented. The hospital's own staff, to their credit, absorbed the new inputs and adapted within minutes. The good ones always did, and Hargrove had more good ones than its administration deserved. Dr. Salazar found his footing around the 15-minute mark. He was a thorough physician and a reasonable man, and what he understood, watching Evelyn move through his department, was that the specific knowledge she had about the exposure compound was not general knowledge and had not come from general nursing training, and that the military team's immediate deference to her was not ceremonial. He filed that information away and kept working. At 1:14 p.m., the firefighter in Bay 3, the one whose numbers had started moving the wrong direction before Evelyn arrived, was stable enough to move to the ICU. His name was Leon Greer, 47, 17-year veteran of Caldwell City Fire Department, father of 3. He would not know until days later how close the margin had been, or who had pulled him back from it. At 1:29, the patient count peaked at 31. 11 critical, 14 serious, 6 walking wounded who had driven themselves to the ER because they didn't trust ambulances, which was its own separate problem that the triage team handled with the resignation of people who had encountered it before. Evelyn was on her third bay when Dottie Farwell appeared at the edge of the trauma department. Dottie wasn't assigned to trauma. She'd heard the overhead page from the 3rd floor and come down on her own time because she'd been at Hargrove for 11 years, and the hospital's MCY protocol was something she'd helped write after a 2019 bus accident, and when an MCI fired, Dottie Farwell showed up. She stopped when she saw the military personnel, stopped again when she saw Evelyn in the middle of it. Their eyes met across the department. Something passed between them that wasn't quite a conversation. Dottie tied her hair back, picked up a pair of gloves from the dispenser by the door, and went to work. Gerald Putnam watched this from the doorway and understood that the narrative he'd been constructing for the past week, the one in which Evelyn Hart was a disruptive employee with interpersonal problems and a performance file that justified administrative action, had been overtaken by events in a way that was going to be very difficult to manage. He retreated to his office and called the board chair. Brock didn't leave. That was his first significant mistake, though he wouldn't recognize it as a mistake for some time. A smarter version of Brock Mercer would have walked out of Hargrove Regional, driven back to the 14th Precinct, and spent the afternoon being very quiet and very unremarkable. The version of Brock who actually existed lingered near the trauma department entrance with the stubborn territorial instinct of a man who didn't know how to retreat without it feeling like defeat. He told himself he was there officially. The custody patient in 308 still needed a check-in, technically. But the custody patient in 308 was a non-issue, and Brock had covered that in 3 minutes. What kept him in the building was something he wouldn't have named honestly: the need to watch, to understand, to find the angle where this stopped being what it looked like. By 2 p.m., that angle had not presented itself. What had presented itself instead was a woman named Captain Adele Tran, who arrived through the ambulance bay at 1:52 in civilian dress with a federal emergency badge clipped to her jacket and a tablet in her hand, and went directly to Colonel Foss. And the two of them had a 15-second conversation before Foss pointed toward the hallway outside the trauma department. Captain Tran walked that direction. Brock was standing in that hallway. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they weren't expecting to find, briefly, assessingly, then again more carefully. "Officer Mercer?" she said. He straightened. "Yeah." "Captain Adele Tran, Federal Medical Emergency Response Division." She held up the badge for exactly long enough to be documented. "Do you have a reason to be in this section of the facility?" "Custody follow-up, room 308. 308 is on the 3rd floor. A pause. "I was observing the response." "Right." She made a note on her tablet. Not an aggressive note, just the particular calm efficiency of someone for whom making notes was as natural as breathing. "Are you acquainted with the responding nurse, Evelyn Hart?" Something shifted in his posture, barely visible, but there. "We've crossed paths." "In what context?" "This is a public hospital. Staff come and go." Tran looked at him for a moment with an expression that gave him nothing. Then she said, "We'll probably want to speak with you at some point. Please make yourself available." "Am I being available?" she said again pleasantly, and walked past him. Brock watched her go. Then he looked back toward the trauma department, where through the window in the door he could see Evelyn at a patient's bedside, still working, still moving with that particular economy of motion that he now recognized. The way you'd recognize something you'd misread the first time and couldn't misread a second time, as training. Deep, specific, hard-won training that nobody acquired, making beds and taking temperatures. He pulled out his phone and called his brother-in-law. The call went to voicemail. He called the precinct captain. That call was answered, but the conversation was short, and the captain's voice had a quality that Brock hadn't heard in it before, something careful and slightly distant, like a man who had just heard something and was now recalibrating his associations. "Sit tight," the captain said. "Don't talk to anyone." "There's a federal." "Don't talk to anyone, Brock." The call ended. Brock stood in the hospital hallway with his phone in his hand and, for the first time in a very long time, felt the particular cold of having no one in the room on his side. The patient count stabilized at 215. The last critical case was a plant worker named Marcus Webb, who had been directly adjacent to the second tank failure and had arrived unconscious with a traumatic head injury and chemical burns covering 30% of his upper body. He was not expected to make it through the first hour. At 3:40 p.m., after surgery led by Salazar, with military medical support, Marcus Webb was in critical but stable condition in the surgical ICU, with a prognosis that the attending neurosurgeon described privately as better than it had any right to be. The military team was thorough, efficient, and operated with a specific kind of quiet intensity that the Hargrove staff would talk about for weeks afterward. But it was the nurse in the gray pullover who the department staff kept looking at, not because she was the loudest or the most dramatic. She wasn't either of those things, but because every time someone didn't know what to do next, she was already 3 steps ahead of where the problem was. And when she gave direction, it wasn't delivered with authority for its own sake, but with the particular precision of someone who had worked in environments where being wrong cost lives. Dottie Farwell, at one point between patients, stopped next to her at the medication dispenser and said, low and direct, "How long have you been keeping this quiet?" Evelyn didn't look up from the chart. It wasn't relevant until it was. The Army doesn't deploy a medical response team for a nurse. They deployed it for the casualties. I'm the point of contact. Dottie was quiet for a moment. "Gerald's in his office. He's been on the phone for an hour." "I know. Are you going to—" "Dottie." Evelyn finally looked up. "Right now, I have 4 patients I'm not satisfied with. Let me finish." Dottie nodded and went back to work. Colonel Foss found Evelyn at 410 in the small supply room off the main corridor that she'd been using as a staging point for chart reviews. He closed the door behind him, which was the first time he'd done anything that suggested the conversation was separate from operational. 18 stable, he said. 3 critical, improving. Webb is the only one I'm watching closely. Webb needs a second neuro consult. Salazar will want to defer to his own team, but the blast injury pattern is consistent with what we saw in... She stopped. "Tell him to look at the parietal pressure distribution before he decides on the drainage plan." "I'll tell him." Foss sat on the edge of a supply shelf in the unselfconscious way of someone comfortable enough in any room to use the furniture. "Tran briefed me." "On what?" "The officer, Mercer." He looked at her steadily. She pulled his employment file. Evelyn set down the chart she was holding. "How fast?" "She was already looking before she got here. The complaint you filed through the hospital system was flagged by our monitoring service 3 days ago. It matched a pattern." She looked at him. "What pattern?" "Mercer has an external file," Foss said. "Not his department file, an independent file. Federal level. It was opened 14 months ago following a complaint from a civilian contractor who said Mercer had coerced her into withdrawing a harassment allegation. That complaint also went nowhere institutionally, but it was picked up by FMERD when the contractor happened to be connected to a federally monitored facility. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. 14 months. You started at Hargrove 15 months ago. The number sat between them. He's done this before, she said. It wasn't a question. The file has 6 entries. Yours would be the 7th if you'd been willing to be intimidated into withdrawing it. Voss looked at her without anything performative in his expression. You weren't. What does Tran need from me? A formal statement and access to whatever documentation you have. She thought of the folder, the photographs on her phone, the secure upload she'd done the night after the HR meeting. I have everything. I know you do. For the first time, something in Voss's expression moved slightly towards something warmer. You always did run a tight documentation protocol. Old habit. Good one. He stood up. Tran wants to meet this evening. Separate location. She'll text you the address. I have patience. They'll be covered. You've done what needed doing here, Hart. Let us handle the rest. She picked the chart back up. I want to see Webb's neuroconsult results first. Voss looked at her for a moment, then nodded once, and left. Putnam's office was on the 4th floor administrative wing, separated from the clinical areas by a carpeted corridor that always smelled faintly of expensive coffee and recycled air. He'd been in that office since 2:30, cycling through phone calls with the board chair, 2 attorneys, the hospital's public relations firm, and his brother, who was a civil mediator in another city, and whose advice Putnam valued because it was always coldly practical. The board chair, a woman named Harriet Doyle, who had run a regional hospital network for 20 years before taking a board position, had listened to Putnam's account of the afternoon in complete silence. When he finished, she said, Gerald, are you telling me we placed a federally credentialed medical officer on administrative leave 4 days before a mass casualty event? We weren't aware of her. Are you telling me that? A pause. Yes. Harriet Doyle was quiet for 3 seconds. Call legal. Don't speak to the press. Don't speak to anyone from a federal agency without counsel present. And Gerald, another pause, heavier than the first. Don't make any additional decisions without calling me first. Any. The call ended. Putnam sat at his desk and looked at the window. Outside, Caldwell City's eastern skyline still had a faint gray haze from the explosion that had happened 6 hours ago and reoriented his entire week. Pamela Voss knocked and entered without waiting. She had the look of someone who had been waiting outside that door for 20 minutes. The HR documentation, she said, meaning the file with Evelyn's name on the tab. It stays locked, Putnam said. Gerald, if there's going to be an investigation, I know, he rubbed his forehead. I know what it looks like. It looks like we manufactured a paper trail to facilitate the removal of an employee who filed a complaint against an officer with political connections to this hospital. Putnam said nothing. Because that's what we did, Pamela said, and for the first time since Evelyn had sat across her desk and asked for a copy of her own file, Pamela Voss sounded like she was telling the truth. Putnam looked at his phone on the desk. The board chair's number was still on the screen. He thought about calling her back. He thought about the 6 weeks of documentation in that HR file, the way each entry had been carefully worded to avoid stating anything directly while implying everything obliquely. He thought about the photograph he'd seen when he Googled Evelyn Hart's name 30 minutes ago and found an 8-year-old press release from the Army, partly redacted, with a list of decorations that he'd had to look up one by one because he didn't recognize the classifications. He closed his phone and stared at the window. At 5:20 p.m., Captain Tran knocked on Brock Mercer's car window in the hospital parking structure. He'd been sitting in his car for 40 minutes. He hadn't left. She held up her badge again. I thought we might as well do this here, she said, when he rolled the window down. It's more comfortable than the federal building. I want a lawyer. You're not under arrest. This is a voluntary interview. I still want a lawyer. She looked at him with the same expression she'd had in the hallway. Not hostile, just present, fully, uncomfortably present. That's your right. She held out a business card through the window. When you're ready, we're not in a hurry. She walked back toward the hospital entrance. Brock held the card and looked at it. Federal Medical Emergency Response Division. Captain A. Tron. A phone number and a case identifier. A case identifier, which meant there was already a case. He called his brother-in-law again. This time it was answered, but the voice on the other end was clipped and short and said, "Brock, I can't be your lifeline right now. Whatever's happening, you need actual legal representation, not me," and hung up. Brock sat in the parking structure with the card in one hand and his phone in the other, and the specific silence of a man who has just discovered that every door he thought was open had quietly closed. Evelyn met with Captain Tron at 7:30 p.m. in a conference room at the extended stay off Route 9, a deliberately unremarkable location, the kind of place that didn't generate interesting security footage. Tran had two other people with her, a quiet man named Agent Dobbins from the Federal Labor Conduct Office, and a woman introduced only as Specialist Reyes, who handled document forensics and said nothing for the first 45 minutes. Evelyn laid her phone on the table and pushed it toward Tran. "Everything's in the secure folder. I'll give you the access code." Tran looked at the phone. "How much is there?" "From the day after the incident with Mercer in the hallway. Photographs of every document they put in my file. Timestamps on the schedule changes. 3 voicemails I saved from the shift coordinator that reference my complaint filing explicitly." Evelyn folded her hands on the table. "I also have a record of every prior instance I'm aware of where Mercer was present in the hospital, cross-referenced with dates where patient complaints in adjacent units were withdrawn or reclassified." Dobbins looked up from his notepad. "You compiled that yourself?" "I had time," she said. Tran was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone recalibrating how much work they thought they were going to have to do. "Walk me through the day of the incident." Evelyn did. She was precise and sequential and entirely without drama. Dates, times, what was said, what was done, who was present, what she observed afterward. She did not characterize. She did not editorialize. She gave Tran the shape of what happened and let the shape speak. When she finished, Tran said, "You were documenting from the beginning, before the HR meeting. From the day after the hallway incident. I didn't know what it would become, but I knew it wouldn't end with an apology." "How did you know that?" Evelyn looked at her steadily. "Because men like Brock Mercer don't apologize. They consolidate." Specialist Reyes, who had been silent for most of the meeting, looked up for the first time. Her eyes were sharp, and she had the quality of someone who spent a lot of time reading documents and had become very good at identifying what was missing from them. "The HR file," she said, "the one Putnam's office compiled. How specific was the documentation?" "Vague in specifics, thorough in pattern. Every entry implied a problem without stating a fact. The dosing disagreement in November was framed as a communication breakdown, without referencing the patient outcome or the fact that I was correct." Reyes nodded slowly. "That's a particular kind of file construction." "Yes," Evelyn said. "It is." Reyes and Tran exchanged a look that carried more information than the words around it. "We're going to need the original file from the hospital's HR system," Tran said. "Not a copy. The original, with metadata intact, because what we're looking for is the sequence of creation, when each entry was actually made relative to when it was dated." Evelyn said, "You think they backdated entries?" "I think it's a question worth answering with evidence rather than assumption." "Can you compel the records?" "We can." Tran closed her notebook. "The industrial incident today triggers a federal coordination mandate that gives FMERD access to any facility records relevant to the emergency response chain, including staffing decisions made in the preceding 30 days. She said it the way you say something you've been waiting for the right moment to say. The administrative leave placed on you 4 days before a mass casualty event affecting a federally credentialed response asset falls within that mandate." Evelyn looked at her, then looked at the table. Something in her chest that had been held at a particular tension for 11 days released incrementally, not all the way, not yet, but enough that she noticed it. "There's one more thing," she said. Tran waited. "The other complaints, the ones before mine. We have those. The contractor 14 months ago. There were others before her. At least 2 that I found through public records, both reclassified. Evelyn looked at Tran directly. He's been doing this for a long time, and the institution has been allowing it. And when I filed my complaint, they didn't just side with him. They actively participated in constructing a case against me. That's not one bad actor. That's a system. The room was quiet. Tran said, "We know." "Then I want to understand what happens to the system." "That's a longer conversation. I'm not going anywhere." Tran looked at her for a moment. The particular look of someone who has spent a career interviewing people who have been through difficult things and can identify the ones who are going to hold. "All right," she said, "let's have it." They talked for another 2 hours. Dottie Farwell sat in the third-floor break room at 9 p.m. with a cup of coffee she'd poured 40 minutes ago and hadn't drunk. Around her, the unit was quieter now. The MCI patients distributed to ICU and surgery, and 2 down to the step-down floor, the trauma department restoring itself to a semblance of order, the military team having cleared out around 6:30 with the particular efficiency of people who arrived for a purpose and left when it was done. Tara Beckwith, one of the younger nurses on the unit, came in and stopped when she saw Dottie's expression. "You okay?" "I've been here 11 years, Dottie said. It wasn't an answer to the question. Tara sat down across from her. "The thing with Evelyn, I should have pushed harder." Dottie looked at her coffee. "When they called me into Putnam's office and asked me if I was certain about what I'd seen, I said yes, but I didn't go further. I let it end there. You filed the witnessing statement, and then I went to lunch." Dottie finally picked up the coffee, looked at it, set it back down. "She was in that building this afternoon because she's trained. Really trained, not just good at the job, trained for things we don't do here. And we walked her out with a security escort and a cardboard box." Tara was quiet. "The soldier called her ma'am," Dottie said, "in front of everyone. The colonel called her ma'am. And I'm sitting here thinking about the way Putnam looked when he heard that, and the way Mercer stepped back, and I keep thinking, she knew. The whole time she knew this was coming, and she just kept doing her job." "She still came in," Tara said. "She didn't have to." "No, she didn't." Dottie looked at the door. "There were 4 people alive tonight who might not have been if she hadn't." Tara had no answer for that, so she made a fresh cup of coffee for Dottie without being asked and sat with her while the unit moved quietly outside the door. At 9:45 p.m., Gerald Putnam's legal counsel informed him that a federal document preservation order had been issued covering all HR records, communications, and administrative files from the past 18 months at Hargrove Regional. No records were to be altered, deleted, or transferred. A federal compliance officer would be on site the following morning. Putnam called Pamela Voss. She answered on the second ring, and he could hear from the quality of her silence when he told her about the order that she had already known this was the direction things were heading. "The metadata," she said. "Don't say it on the phone." "Gerald, don't say it on the phone." He pressed his hand flat against his desk. "Call your attorney. Personal attorney, not the hospital's." A long silence. "Is it that bad?" He looked at his window. Caldwell City's skyline, dark now, the chemical haze from the day's explosion finally dispersed. "Call your attorney," he said again, and hung up. His phone showed 7 missed calls from numbers he didn't recognize, and one from the board chair's cell phone that had come in at 9:38. He looked at that one for a long time before picking up. Brock Mercer got home at 10:15. His wife was asleep. He sat at the kitchen table without turning on the light and looked at Captain Tran's card, which he'd been carrying since the parking structure. There was a case number on it. That kept coming back to him. Not the name, not the agency, not even the federal designation. The case number. Which meant the file was already open, which meant they weren't starting an investigation because of today. They'd been waiting for something to attach it to. The something was him. He thought about the hallway. Papers scattered across the floor. The nurse crouching to collect them and looking up at him with that particular stillness, that nothing to work with look that he'd read as challenge and that he understood now, sitting in his dark kitchen, had been something else entirely. Had been patience. Had been someone who had learned a long time ago to let events build their own case. He reached for his phone and then stopped. His brother-in-law wasn't answering. The precinct captain wanted him quiet. His personal attorney, who he'd called from the parking structure, had taken the details down and said, "Brock, this is federal. This is above what I do. I can refer you, but you need to understand. If there's a file, they've been building it, and you need to stop talking to anyone until you have someone beside you who knows what they're doing. Stop talking. Stay quiet. He'd built his whole career on being the loudest person in the room. He put the card face down on the table and looked at the ceiling and thought about 6 entries in a federal file and a 7th that wouldn't stay withdrawn, and the way an entire hospital trauma department had rearranged itself around a woman he'd shoved aside and laughed at, and the specific sound of a military officer saying, "We've been waiting for your orders," to a nurse he'd tried to have erased. He thought about that for a long time in the dark. And then his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Not Tran's number, a different one. And it said only, "Officer Mercer, federal warrant to be served at your residence. Tomorrow, 8 a.m. You may wish to have counsel present." He read it twice, then set the phone face down next to the card. Outside, the night was quiet. Inside, something had ended that he hadn't had the chance to see ending, which was the worst way for things to end. Without warning, without the dignity of a fight, just the slow realization that the ground you'd been standing on had been dissolving for longer than you knew, and the only reason you hadn't fallen yet was that nobody had needed you to fall until now. He picked the card back up, called the number. It rang twice before Tron answered, and her voice was the same as it had been in the parking structure, present, calm, completely unsurprised to hear from him at 10:30 at night. And she said, "Officer Mercer, I was wondering when you'd call." I was wondering when you'd call, landed in the kitchen like something Brock had no response for, which was new. He was not a man who ran out of responses. He'd built a career on having a response, a quick one, a loud one, the kind that filled a room before anyone else could organize their thoughts. But Tran's voice on the other end of that line had a quality that made responses feel beside the point, like she'd already accounted for whatever he might say and filed it appropriately. He said, "I want to know what's in the file." "I think you already know what's in the file," Tron said. "What you actually want to know is how much of it we can prove." The silence that followed told her everything she needed. "Get your attorney on the phone," she said. "Not the one you called this afternoon, someone federal. Then call me back. We can talk about what tomorrow looks like before 8 a.m., or we can do it after. Your choice." A beat. "Get some sleep if you can." She hung up. Brock set the phone down on the table and left it there. The federal compliance officer arrived at Hargrove Regional at 7:15 a.m. the following morning, 45 minutes ahead of the stated time, which was deliberate. His name was Agent Clifton Marsh, and he came with a document preservation order, a forensic IT specialist named Park, and the particular purposeful quietness of someone whose job was to walk into institutions that had been managing their own narratives and stop them from continuing to do so. Marsh went directly to administration. Park went directly to the server room. Putnam was there when they arrived, which his attorney had advised. The attorney, a woman named Sandra Weil, who had flown in from the regional office of a healthcare litigation firm, stood beside him with the careful body language of someone whose job was to limit the damage she hadn't caused. Marsh laid the preservation order on Putnam's desk without ceremony. "We'll need access to the HR system, all communications records for the past 18 months, and the building security footage archive." "The security footage," Putnam began. "Specifically, the third-floor corridor, dates to be specified in the supplemental order." Marsh looked at him steadily. "Is there a reason that would be a problem?" Sandra Weil put her hand on Putnam's arm, lightly, the way lawyers do when they want you to stop forming sentences. "No problem," she said. "We'll cooperate fully." Park was already in the server room by then, working through the hospital's records infrastructure with the systematic efficiency of someone who had done this before and knew exactly where institutions hid things when they were hiding them. Not in the files themselves, but in the metadata, the revision histories, the timestamp sequences that recorded not just what a document said, but when each line of it had been written, and by whom and in what order relative to the events it purported to document. It took Park 4 hours and 20 minutes to find what Tran had suspected. Evelyn slept 6 hours and woke at 6 a.m. to 3 missed messages, one from Tran confirming the morning's access operation, one from Colonel Foss with Marcus Webb's overnight neurology update, and one from a number she recognized as belonging to Dr. Salazar. She opened Salazar's message last. It said, "I looked up your service record, as much of it as is public. I owe you an apology. Not for today. You handled today better than anyone in this building could have. For before. We should have said something when the escort happened. I should have said something. I didn't. I'm sorry." She read it twice, then typed back, "Webb's pressure distribution." Did the second neuroconsult look at the parietal imaging? He replied in 2 minutes. Yes. They adjusted the drainage plan. He's off the critical list as of an hour ago. She set the phone down and sat at the edge of her bed for a moment. Outside the window, Caldwell City was doing the thing it always did in the morning, going about its business with the determined normalcy of a place that had been through bad days before and would be through them again. The refinery towers catching early light, traffic on the 9 already building, a city with a haze of smoke still faintly readable on the skyline from yesterday's disaster, and no particular patience for dwelling on it. She made coffee. She called Tran. "Webb is off the critical list," she said when Tran answered. "I heard. Boss told me." Tran's voice had the quality of someone who had also slept 6 hours and decided 6 was enough. "Marsh is in the building. Park found something." Evelyn waited. The HR file. Specifically, the November entry. The dosing disagreement that was cited as a communication breakdown. The system metadata shows it was created 2 days after your formal complaint was filed, not before. The date in the document header was manually altered. The coffee in Evelyn's hand was warm enough to feel in her palm. She focused on that for a second. "That's document fraud." "It is, and it's not isolated to that entry." Tran paused. 3 of the 6 entries in your file were created or substantially modified after the complaint date. The revision history was overwritten but not fully cleared, which is an extremely common mistake in institutions that have never had their HR system forensically examined before, because nobody thinks it'll come to that. Pamela Voss. Her credentials are on the modifications. Yes. Another pause. Putnam is represented by outside counsel. Voss came in this morning without one. That's not smart. No, Tran agreed. It's not. Evelyn set her coffee down. What do you need from me today? Your formal statement is complete from last night. What I'd like, Tran said, measured, is for you to come to the hospital this afternoon. Not for the investigation. I'm asking you to come as the person you are, which is the responding clinical officer from yesterday's event, doing a follow-up review on the MCI patients you triaged. Completely legitimate clinical basis. I want you in that building. Evelyn understood immediately. You want witness reaction. I want everything on record, Tran said, including who says what to whom when you walk through the door. Set. She arrived at Hargrove Regional at 1:30 p.m. in her uniform. Not scrubs, not the gray pullover, but the formal service khakis she hadn't worn in months, with the insignia and the record of service attached the way regulations required when appearing in an official capacity connected to a federal operation. She'd considered the civilian clothes. She chose the uniform deliberately, for the same reason Tran had chosen the extended stay off Route 9 for their meeting. Because context shaped narrative, and today the context needed to be unambiguous. The lobby desk staff looked up when she walked in. There was a pause, the small pause of people reassembling information, and then the woman at the main desk said, "Nurse Hart." And there was something in the way she said it that was different from anything that had preceded it, not the performance of deference, just the register of someone who had recategorized a person overnight. She took the elevator to the 3rd floor. Dottie was at the nurse's station and looked up when the elevator doors opened and went absolutely still for 1 second before her face rearranged itself into something that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite relief. Something more complicated than either of those things. The expression of a person processing several layers of feeling at once and not trying to simplify them. You look different, Dottie said. Same person, Evelyn said. I know. Dottie looked at the insignia. I just mean, I know. She glanced down the corridor toward the administrative wing. They're in there. Marsh and 2 others. Voss is in the HR office, and she looks like she hasn't slept. Where's Putnam? Boardroom, with his lawyer and Harriet Doyle. The board chair came in person. Evelyn absorbed that. Harriet Doyle in person meant the board was not managing this from a distance, which meant the board had decided that distance was no longer a viable strategy. And Mercer? Dottie shook her head. Not here. I heard the morning shift say something about a federal proceeding downtown. Evelyn nodded once. I'm doing follow-up review on yesterday's patients. ICU first. Bay 7's family has been asking about who made the call on the inhalation protocol, Dottie said quietly. They know something happened there. The doctors were honest with them, apparently. I'll speak with them if they want. She moved toward the ICU corridor and Dottie watched her go, and the three nurses at the station who had been pointedly not watching. The conversation watched her go too, in the particular way that people watch when they're trying to look like they're not. Marcus Webb was conscious. That was the first thing, and it was enough to require a moment. He was intubated and sedated to a degree that put him somewhere between sleep and awareness. But his vitals on the monitor above the bed were the vitals of a man who had come back from a significant distance, and the neurologist's notes in his chart reflected a trajectory that had no business being as positive as it was given the initial presentation. His wife, Nora Webb, was in the chair beside the bed. Early 40s, the specific exhaustion of someone who had spent 24 hours being strong in public and hadn't had anywhere private enough to stop yet. She looked up when Evelyn entered, and something in her face sharpened. Not recognition exactly, but the instinct of a woman who could tell when the person coming through the door was the relevant one. "Are you the nurse?" she asked. Evelyn stopped at the bedside. "I was part of the team yesterday." "They said—" Nora stopped, steadied. "The doctor said there was someone who caught something about the chemical exposure, something the regular protocol missed. The plant had updated their formulation, and the safety sheet hadn't been updated to match," Evelyn said. "We had the current data." "He was getting worse." Nora's voice was controlled, but the control was costing her. "Before you got there. The nurse at the time, she was doing everything right, but she was using the wrong information. She was using what she had. And then it changed." Nora looked at her husband's face, still and pale against the pillow. "He woke up for a few minutes at 4 this morning. He squeezed my hand." Evelyn looked at Marcus Webb in the bed. The blast burns on his arms visible above the blanket, the ventilator breathing for him, the monitors translating the interior work of a body fighting its way back. She'd seen people this far down before, in other buildings, other countries, other circumstances. The medicine was different depending on the setting, but the human dimension of it, the particular weight of sitting next to someone you loved and not knowing, was always the same. "He's moving in the right direction," she said. Nora looked up at her. "Thank you." It came out uneven at the edges, which was the truest version of it. Evelyn nodded once and moved to the next patient because there were 7 more who needed reviewing, and gratitude, however genuine, was not the work. She was in the 4th ICU bay, reviewing the chart of a plant worker named Denny Fry with a respiratory injury that had stabilized overnight when her phone buzzed with a message from Tran. "Park finished? We have enough. Coming to you." She finished the chart note first, then replied, "ICU 4. Tran arrived 4 minutes later with Agent Dobbins and a third person Evelyn hadn't seen before. A woman in her 50s with the bearing of someone who made decisions that had consequences, introduced as Deputy Director Colleen Varga from the Federal Labor Conduct Oversight Division. Varga looked at Evelyn in the service khakis with the calm assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating people quickly. "Nurse Hart, I've been reading your file." "Which one?" Evelyn said. Something in Varga's expression acknowledged the weight of that. "Both. The HR file from this institution and the Federal Service record." She was quiet for a moment. "I want you to understand the scope of what we've found before it becomes official, because you're a party to this and you deserve to know before it becomes public." Evelyn set the chart down. "Tell me." The metadata on the HR documentation shows systematic backdating of 3 file entries, all created or modified after your complaint was logged in the federal monitoring system. That establishes document fraud and obstruction of a protected complaint process. Varga kept her voice even and factual. "We also pulled Mercer's communication records. his department phone, and his personal phone, which was accessed under the warrant issued this morning. And? He made 11 calls to Putnam's office number in the 3 days following your complaint. 6 of them were returned. Varga paused. We also found a series of texts between Mercer and his brother-in-law, who sits on the hospital board, in which the administrative leave decision is discussed before it was formally initiated. The language used is specific enough to establish coordination. The hallway outside the ICU bay was ordinary. The sounds of a hospital doing its usual business, monitors, carts, the ambient hum of a building that kept running regardless of what was happening in its administrative wing. Evelyn stood in the middle of that ordinary sound and let Varga's words arrange themselves into the shape they made. That implicates the board, she said. One member, definitively. The board chair is cooperating. Harriet Doyle came in this morning of her own initiative and brought documentation of her own attempts to flag Mercer's conduct through board channels 18 months ago, which were overruled by the member in question. Varga looked at her. She's not a target. She's a witness. Dobbins, who had been quiet until now, said, Mercer came in this morning with counsel. He's being cooperative, which his attorney clearly advised. He said it without judgment, the way you report a fact. He's providing a fuller account of the prior complaints. Evelyn looked at the chart in her hand. Denny Fry, 41, respiratory injury, oxygen saturation improving. She thought about the 6 entries in Mercer's file before hers. 6 people who'd filed complaints and been pressured into withdrawal or reclassification. 6 people who had measured the weight of the institution against the weight of continuing to fight it and decided they couldn't carry both. What happens to the prior complaints? She said. Varga was quiet for a moment. They're being reviewed, all 6. The individuals will be contacted. They were told nothing could be done. They were told incorrectly. Varga held her gaze. What Mercer and the institutional actors around him relied on was the assumption that each complaint was isolated, that there was no one connecting the pattern, that each person who came forward was navigating it alone. She stopped. Let that sentence sit. Evelyn understood what she was not quite saying, that the thing which had broken the pattern was not the Federal Monitoring Service, not the industrial explosion, not the military response team. It was a nurse who had documented everything from day one and refused to withdraw her complaint and was still in the building that afternoon doing follow-up care on patients she'd triaged in a gray pullover the day before. Varga said, We're moving to formal proceedings this afternoon. Mercer will be placed on administrative suspension pending formal charges. Putnam and Voss will be notified of their status as subjects of a federal investigation. The board member, his name is Craig Lofton, will be removed from the board pending the same. What about the hospital? Hargrove Regional will operate under a federal oversight agreement until the investigation is complete. The board chair has already agreed to the terms. Varga looked at her carefully. The question of your reinstatement is a separate matter, but I want to be direct. The administrative leave is not defensible in light of the evidence. The hospital's legal team is aware of this. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Outside the bay window, the ICU unit continued. A nurse crossed the hall. A family member passed in the corridor. The ordinary motion of a place where people were fighting to be alive. I want it in writing, she said. All of it. You'll have it, Varga said. Everything, Tron said from slightly behind Varga. We're going to the administrative wing now. I thought you should know before we walked in there. Evelyn looked at her. Who's being notified first? Putnam, his attorney's present so the notification can happen properly. Then Voss. Tran held her gaze. Then Lofton, remotely. He's not in the building. A pause. Mercer? He's already been notified. It's done. Something in Tran's expression shifted, barely. He didn't fight it. His attorney advised him not to. Evelyn set Denny Fry's chart back in the holder at the foot of the bed. She looked at the patient, still sleeping, oxygen saturation at 94 and improving, and then she straightened and looked at Varga. Do what you need to do, she said. I have 2 more patients to review. Varga looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. The 3 of them moved toward the administrative corridor. Evelyn went to the next bay. She was reviewing the 6 patients' chart, a young plant technician named Gail Soriano, 26, who had been furthest from the blast and had the best prognosis of the group. When Dottie appeared at the bay entrance with an expression that had crossed from complicated into something much simpler. "They just walked Voss out," Dottie said. Evelyn didn't look up from the chart. "Okay. Not security escort, federal agents." Dottie was quiet for a second. "The whole floor watched it." "Does it document what you saw?" Evelyn said, the same thing she'd said 11 days ago in a different hallway with a different cardboard box and a different direction of motion. "Date, time, witnesses." Dottie looked at her. "Evelyn?" She finally looked up. "Putnam's attorney just came out of the boardroom," Dottie said. "She was on the phone. I heard her say the words criminal referral." The chart was steady in Evelyn's hands. Her face was steady. Her voice was steady when she said, "How's Soriano's respiratory rate trending since midnight?" Dottie blinked, looked at the monitor. "Down to 16. That's good." "It's good," Evelyn agreed, and went back to the chart. She was finishing the notation when her phone buzzed with a message from a number she'd never seen before. She almost didn't open it. There were too many new numbers in the past 48 hours, too many moving parts. But something made her look. The message was a photograph, a screenshot, specifically, of a document she recognized, the format of Hargrove Regional's internal incident reporting system, the same system she'd used to file her original complaint 11 days ago. But this wasn't her complaint. It was a complaint filed 2 years ago by a patient who had been in custody in room 308, Brock Mercer's regular stop, and had withdrawn the filing 6 days later after what the attached note described as a voluntary reconsideration. The patient's name at the top of the report was Leon Greer, the same Leon Greer who was currently recovering in the ICU from blast lung. The firefighter Evelyn had stabilized yesterday. The same man who, per the report date on the screenshot, had once filed a complaint against Officer Brock Mercer and then, inexplicably, taken it back. Under the screenshot, whoever had sent it had written 4 words. He didn't withdraw it. Evelyn stood in Bay 6 with her phone in her hand and the chart forgotten, and looked at those 4 words and understood that what she'd thought was the outer edge of what Brock Mercer had done was not the outer edge at all. 4 words on a screen, and the ground shifted again. Evelyn stood in Bay 6 with the phone in her hand and ran the timeline backward the way she'd been trained to. Not emotionally, not yet, just structurally. Leon Greer had filed a complaint against Brock Mercer 2 years ago. The complaint had been logged in the hospital's internal system, which meant it had passed through the same intake process as hers, the same HR infrastructure, the same chain of awareness that included Pamela Voss and, almost certainly, Gerald Putnam. 6 days later, it was withdrawn. The attached note said voluntary reconsideration, the same bureaucratic softening language that made a coerced withdrawal look like a change of heart. Except it wasn't voluntary. Someone who knew that was telling her so with 4 words and a screenshot at 2:47 in the afternoon. She looked at the number again. Unknown. Not Tran's number, not Foss's, not anyone in the operational circles she'd been moving through for the past 2 days. Someone else. Someone who had the complaint document and Leon Greer's name and the specific knowledge that the withdrawal had been manufactured, and who had decided that now, with federal agents walking Pamela Voss through the hospital corridor, was the moment to surface it. She forwarded the screenshot to Tran with a single line. Who has access to internal complaint records from 2 years ago? Then she put the phone in her pocket and went to the ICU. Leon Greer was in Bay 2, off the ventilator as of that morning, breathing on his own with supplemental oxygen through a nasal cannula and the particular careful quality of a man who had recently rediscovered that breathing was not automatic. His voice was rough and low when Evelyn came in, and he tracked her with his eyes the way people do when they've been unconscious and are still taking inventory of who's real. "You were here yesterday," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd been told, or he'd pieced it together from the way the staff moved around her when she came in. "I was." She pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat, which she didn't always do. Sitting changed the conversation, made it less clinical, and right now she needed less clinical. "How's the breathing?" "Hurts. Feels like someone filled my chest with sand." He shifted against the pillow. They said I was doing better. You are. Your O2 sat this morning was significantly improved from yesterday afternoon. He nodded slowly, then looked at the ceiling for a moment. I heard them talking, out in the hall, something about federal people, in the building. She held the phone in her pocket but didn't take it out. There's an investigation running. Into the explosion? Partly. She looked at him directly. Leon, 2 years ago you filed a complaint through this hospital's internal reporting system against Officer Brock Mercer. The change in his face was immediate and specific. Not surprise, not alarm, but the expression of a man who has been carrying something for 2 years and has just been told that someone else knows the weight of it. How do you know that? His voice had dropped below rough into something quieter. Someone sent me the document an hour ago, the original filing. He looked at his hands on the blanket. The blast burns on his forearms were bandaged to the elbow, and below the bandages his hands were the hands of a man who had spent 17 years fighting fires. Broad, scarred, the knuckles slightly enlarged. He was quiet for long enough that Evelyn let the quiet sit. I was here for a shoulder injury, he said finally. Off-duty thing. I was in 308. That's where they put the custody patients, but sometimes overflow goes there when census is high. And I wasn't custody, I was just... They put me there. A pause. Mercer came in to see someone 2 rooms down. I heard him through the wall, the way he talked to this kid who was handcuffed to the bed, 19 years old, some possession charge. He was just... Leon stopped. The things he said, and how he said them. I wrote it down afterward, everything I'd heard, filed it through the system the way you're supposed to, and then withdrew it 6 days later. He came to the firehouse. Leon said it flat, like a fact with all the feeling pressed out of it by 2 years of pressure. Not in uniform. Off hours. Knew my shift schedule, knew when I'd be there alone. Sat down across from me in the bay and said he'd heard I'd filed something and he wanted to clear up any misunderstanding. A pause. He had photographs. Of my brother. My brother had some issues back then. Legal issues. Mercer laid those photographs on the table and said it would be a shame if someone looked more carefully at the situation. He coerced your withdrawal. He implied. Never said it directly. Wasn't stupid enough to say it directly. Leon's jaw tightened. I went back to the hospital the next day and said I'd changed my mind. The woman in HR, she had short hair, always very put together. Voss. She didn't ask any questions, just processed it, like she was relieved to have it go away. He looked at Evelyn. Your complaint. I heard about it when it happened. 3rd floor nurses talk. I know. I almost called you. He said it with the specific quality of a regret that has been sitting long enough to calcify. I almost said something, but I thought... He stopped. You thought it would happen to you again, she said. Not judgment, just fact. I've got a brother whose situation is still fragile, and I thought... He exhaled carefully, the careful exhale of a man whose lungs are healing. I thought it was too late. That yours would go the same way mine did. Evelyn looked at him, thought about the way certain systems worked. Not through dramatic corruption, but through the patient accumulated weight of small coercions. Brock hadn't needed to threaten everyone directly. He'd needed to establish enough examples that the threat preceded him. It didn't go the same way, she said. Leon was quiet for a moment. Then, I can see that. I need you to give a formal statement about what happened 2 years ago. The firehouse visit. What he said. What he had. She met his eyes. I know what I'm asking. My brother, the investigation is federal. What Mercer held over you, the photographs, whatever he had on your brother, threatening to deploy that as retaliation against a complaint witness is its own separate federal offense. It adds to his exposure. It doesn't threaten your brother. She paused. But I can't promise you the process is painless. It isn't. I won't tell you it is. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside in the corridor, someone's monitor alarm sounded briefly and then silenced. A nurse had gotten there, adjusted something, the ordinary intervention of a working unit. Leon watched the ceiling. My crew chief came in this morning, he said. Sat right where you're sitting. Told me what he heard happened in the trauma department yesterday. Told me what the ER staff was saying about who made the call on the protocol. He looked at her. He said you were on administrative leave when you came in. I was. But you came in anyway. There were patients. Leon Greer looked at her with the expression of a man making a decision he'd been circling for 2 years. Get me a pen, he said, and whatever form they use. Tran's reply came while Evelyn was still in Leon's room. The complaint records from 2 years ago are accessible to current HR staff and to board members with administrative access. Pulling the access logs now. Who sent you the screenshot? Evelyn replied, unknown number, someone who wanted me to find it before it could disappear. 3 minutes passed. Then, the access logs show the complaint file was opened twice in the past 48 hours. Once by Voss yesterday morning, before the agents arrived. Once by Craig Lofton at 11:47 p.m. last night. She read that twice. Lofton, the board member, Mercer's brother-in-law, accessing a 2-year-old suppressed complaint file at midnight, the same night federal agents had served a warrant on Mercer's residence. He'd been looking for exposure, looking to see what could still surface. And instead of closing the file quietly, he'd opened it, left a digital footprint in the access log at midnight, the kind of footprint that told a story. Does Lofton know the access logs are part of the preservation order? She typed. Tran's response was almost immediate. He does now. The formal proceedings moved fast once Leon Greer's statement was added to the federal file. The particular acceleration of an investigation that has just acquired a witness who can speak to a pattern of coercion that predates the primary complaint by 2 years. Dobbins spent 90 minutes with Leon that afternoon, a recorder on the table between them, while Evelyn reviewed her remaining patients in the ICU and tried to hold the work separate from the noise. It wasn't entirely possible. The hospital was doing what hospitals do when something significant is happening in the administrative wing. The information moved in fragments through the staff, incomplete and slightly distorted at each transfer, but directionally accurate. By 4 p.m., the third-floor nurses knew that Voss had been walked out. By 4:30, they knew Putnam was still in the boardroom with counsel and hadn't come out since noon. By 5, word had spread to the surgical floor that a federal document order was active and that the HR system had been locked for external access. Tara Beckwith found Evelyn in the medication room off the ICU corridor and said, with the directness of someone who had decided to just say the thing, "Is it true they found that the HR file was faked?" "I can't comment on an active investigation," Evelyn said. Tara absorbed that. "That's basically a yes." "I can't comment on an active investigation." Evelyn looked at her. "You have patience." "So do you." Tara leaned against the doorframe. "For what it's worth, and I know it's late, and I know that's on us, most of the floor is on your side. They have been. People were just scared." Evelyn finished the chart notation she was making. "Fear's not nothing," she said. "I know what it costs to go up against someone like Mercer. I don't hold it against people that they calculated the risk." "But you didn't calculate it." She looked up. "I calculated it differently." At 6:15 p.m., Gerald Putnam's attorney issued a public statement on his behalf, not to the press yet, but to the hospital board and staff, through the institution's internal communication system. It was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph expressed Putnam's commitment to the investigation process. The second paragraph acknowledged that certain administrative decisions made in the recent period are being reviewed. The third paragraph announced his voluntary suspension from operational duties pending the investigation's completion. Voluntary. The word doing a lot of work in one sentence. Harriet Doyle sent a separate message to all staff 20 minutes later, in the direct, unhedged language of someone who had decided that institutional voice mattered more than institutional caution. It said, "The board has accepted Mr. Putnam's suspension and has initiated an independent review of administrative practices at Hargrove Regional going back 24 months. This review is being conducted in full cooperation with federal authorities. We will share findings with our staff and community as they become available. Hargrove Regional is committed to accountability, not as a statement, but as a practice." More to follow. Dottie Farwell read the message at the nurses' station and then walked to the break room and sat down alone for 4 minutes. When she came back out, her expression had settled into something that wasn't satisfaction. more like the specific relief of a person who has been holding their breath for longer than they realized and has only just noticed they can stop. She didn't say anything to the staff about it. She didn't have to. Craig Lofton was a man who had spent 30 years in real estate development and 9 years on the hospital board and had never, in either context, had to answer directly for anything, which was the particular advantage of being the kind of person who stayed one relationship removed from every decision he influenced. He had never told Putnam to falsify documents. He had never told Voss to construct a paper trail. He had made phone calls, offered opinions, applied the comfortable pressure of a man whose goodwill mattered institutionally. And the people around him had translated that pressure into action and absorbed the risk that came with it. That was the system. That was how it worked. Until it didn't. He was in his car in a parking garage in the city center, on the phone with a lawyer who was not the hospital's lawyer and was currently explaining in very careful language what the federal access log showing his midnight review of a suppressed complaint file was going to look like in a preservation-ordered evidentiary context, when a second call came through from a number that made him stop mid-sentence. It was Mercer. He let it ring. Then he put the lawyer on hold and answered it, because not answering Brock Mercer at this particular moment felt dangerous in a way he couldn't clearly define. Craig. Mercer's voice was different from what Lofton was used to. Not the easy, slightly loud confidence of a man who assumed the room was arranged in his favor. Something tighter. They have the phone records. I know. All of them. The calls to Putnam, the text chain. A pause. The ones about the nurse. I know, Lofton said again. He said it the way you say something when you're trying not to say anything else. Craig, what's going to happen? Get off the phone, call your attorney. Lofton kept his voice level. Don't call me again. I need to know if you're... Brock. For the first time, Lofton's voice had something hard in it. Not protective hard, not ally hard, the hardness of a man drawing a line for his own benefit. We're done talking. That's not a position. That's legal advice. Call your attorney. He hung up. Then sat in the parking garage and called the lawyer back and said, I want to discuss cooperation terms. The call between Lofton and his attorney lasted 45 minutes. The agreement to cooperate with the federal investigation, with terms to be negotiated, was confirmed at 8:30 that evening. Tran received notification at 8:47 and forwarded it to Evelyn at 9:01 with a message that said, Lofton is cooperating. His account of the communication chain between himself, Mercer, and Putnam is consistent with what the phone records show. The file is complete. Evelyn was home by then, had left the hospital at 7:30 after finishing her last patient review, after making sure Gail Soriano's respiratory numbers were trending the right direction and that Leon Greer's statement had been properly witnessed and logged. She was sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, reading Tran's message, when the follow-up came. Formal charges for Mercer being processed tonight. Putnam and Voss are subjects of a federal obstruction referral. Charges expected within the week. Lofton removed from board effective immediately per Doyle's authority. Press release from FMERD going out tomorrow morning. She read it. Set the phone down. Picked up the coffee. Realized it was cold. Set it back down. Outside, Caldwell City was doing what it did on Thursday evenings in March. Cars on the arterial road. A dog somewhere in the distance. The particular ambient quiet of a city that didn't know what had happened in its hospital today and wouldn't know until tomorrow's news cycle made it legible. She thought about Leon Greer in Bay 2, breathing carefully. Marcus Webb in the surgical ICU, whose wife had sat in that chair for 24 hours. The plant technician, Gail Soriano, 26 years old, who was going to walk out of the ICU in 4 days and not know how close he'd come. She thought about the 6 people who had filed complaints before hers and been told the system had no room for what they were reporting, and who would receive calls this week from a federal investigator asking them to reopen something they'd closed to protect themselves. She thought about the gray pullover she'd been wearing when she walked into a failing mass casualty response yesterday morning, and the uniform she'd worn today, and the cardboard box she'd carried out of this hospital 11 days ago with a landscape print inside that she'd bought because the color was nice. The phone buzzed once more. Not Tran this time. Voss. Webb's neurologist filed the final consult, upgraded to serious stable. off the critical list permanently. Thought you'd want to know before you slept. She looked at that message for a long time. Then she got up, poured the cold coffee out, made a new cup, and sat back down. She had 6 people to call tomorrow. 6 people who had withdrawn complaints, who had decided the weight of the institution was too much to push back against, who deserved to know that the record was being corrected. That was tomorrow's work, and it was real work, and it mattered. Tonight, the coffee was hot, and the city was quiet, and 4 people who had been near death yesterday were moving in the right direction. She let that be enough. The press release from FMERD went out at 7 a.m. the following morning and was picked up by the regional wire by 7:30. By 8 a.m., it was on the front page of the Caldwell City Courier's digital edition under the headline, Federal Investigation into Police Officer, Hospital Administration Following MCOI Response. By 9, 2 regional television stations had crews outside Hargrove Regional. By 10, the National Wire had picked it up in brief. Brock Mercer was formally suspended from the Caldwell City Police Department at 8:15 a.m., pending the criminal charges being processed through the federal system. The department's statement was 4 sentences long and contained the phrase, "We take all misconduct allegations seriously," twice, which was the particular repetition of an institution trying to create the impression of a position it hadn't previously held. He turned in his badge and his weapon and his department vehicle in the parking lot of the 14th Precinct, with no ceremony, in the company of his attorney and a union representative who said almost nothing. The precinct captain watched from the building entrance without coming down, which told Brock everything about how the institutional math had shifted. The drive home was 32 minutes. He did it without music. He had been a police officer for 19 years, and the arithmetic of who he'd been for those 19 years was resolving itself into something he couldn't look at all at once. Pamela Voss was placed on administrative leave from Hargrove Regional that same morning, with a separate letter advising her that the federal obstruction referral was proceeding and that she should direct all inquiries to personal counsel. She read the letter in her car in the hospital parking lot because she hadn't been allowed past the lobby, and then sat there for 20 minutes and then drove away. Putnam's voluntary suspension became effective. The administrative wing on the 4th floor had a quality that morning of a house whose owner has recently left. The visible evidence of ongoing institutional life, the coffee running in the break room, the assistants answering phones, but something absent in the architecture of the place, something that had organized the space for years and was now not there. Harriet Doyle walked the 4th floor at 10 a.m. with the hospital's legal counsel and the new interim operations director, a woman named Cassandra Tull, who had been brought in from a regional medical system to hold the institutional structure while the investigation ran. Doyle had been on hospital boards for 20 years and had seen administrators fail before, but the specific shape of this failure was the coordination between Putnam and Lofton, the manufactured file, the suppression of Mercer's pattern over 14 months, had a quality she kept returning to privately. Not shock. Something more like the specific exhaustion of discovering that a structure you'd trusted had been hollow in a particular place for a particular reason, and that the hollow was not new. At 11:30, Tull sent a facility-wide message introducing herself and announcing that a staff listening session would be held the following week. The response from the nursing staff was the largest volume of internal messages the administrative system had processed in a single hour in the hospital's digital history. At 2 p.m., Evelyn walked back into Hargrove Regional. No uniform this time. Gray pullover again, the same one. Her badge hadn't been formally reinstated yet. The paperwork was in process. But Tull had called her at 11 and asked if she'd come in, and Evelyn had said yes because there were still 4 patients in the ICU she wanted to look at, and because there was no version of returning that felt entirely clean, and the absence of cleanness was not a reason to wait. The lobby desk staff said her name when she walked in, and the security officer at the door, not the 24-year-old from 11 days ago, a different one, held the door open with a small nod that carried more information than the gesture itself. She took the elevator to the 3rd floor. The unit was in the middle of afternoon rounds, which was the controlled, organized motion she was used to. Carts moving, clipboards changing hands, the overlap of 2 conversations happening 4 feet apart. 3 nurses at the station looked up when she walked off the elevator. One of them, a woman named Priscilla, who had been on the unit for 3 years and had been very specifically not looking when the security escort had walked Evelyn to her locker 11 days ago, pushed back from her chair and crossed the floor and said, without ceremony, "Welcome back," in the voice of someone who had been rehearsing the sentence and was relieved to have said it. Evelyn nodded. "Thanks, Priscilla." She went to the break room and poured a coffee and stood at the counter for a moment with the cup in her hands, in the room where nothing had changed. Same table, same chairs, same bulletin board with the same outdated CPR refresher notice, and let the ordinary familiarity of it land without trying to make it mean more than it did. She'd been in this break room 100 times. She was in it again. The unit needed nursing, and she was a nurse. That was the working structure of it, and the working structure was enough to stand on. She was 3 sips into the coffee when Dottie appeared in the doorway with an expression that was doing several things at once. "Toll wants to meet you," Dottie said. "This afternoon, whenever you're free." She specifically said not to rush you. "I'll find her after rounds." Evelyn looked at Dottie. "How's the floor?" "Holding." Dottie came into the room and leaned against the counter across from her. "People are processing. Some are angry. Not at you, at the situation. Some are relieved. Some are doing that thing where they act like nothing happened because it's easier." A pause. "Tara cried this morning. In the supply room, I pretended not to notice." "Good call." "Yeah." Dottie was quiet for a moment. "Dr. Salazar wants to talk to you too. He's been on rounds since 6. He looks like he hasn't slept. He's been running trauma for 2 days on top of everything else. He probably hasn't. He said he's been thinking about the November dosing incident, the one that ended up in your file." Evelyn looked at her coffee. "What about it?" "He said he should have backed you up in writing at the time, instead of just letting the verbal correction stand." Dottie looked at her steadily. "He's going to say that to you himself. I'm just telling you so you're not surprised, and you don't do that thing where you deflect and say, 'It's fine.' It is fine." "Evelyn." She looked up. "Let people say what they need to say," Dottie said. Not gently, not harshly, just directly, in the way of someone who has known her long enough to know the specific way she moves away from acknowledgement. "You did what you did. Let them respond to it." Evelyn was quiet for a moment, then, "You should have been a counselor." "I'm a nurse, same thing, less paperwork." Dottie pushed off the counter. "Rounds in 5, you coming?" She was. Toll's office was the COO's office, Putnam's former office, with the same view of Caldwell City's eastern skyline, though someone had already removed the framed institutional awards from the credenza, leaving rectangular dust shadows where they'd hung. Cassandra Toll was 60, lean, with close-cropped gray hair, and the particular organized energy of someone who was comfortable taking over difficult situations because she'd done it before and knew what the work actually required. She stood up when Evelyn came in and offered her hand and said, "I've read everything." She meant the file, the federal documentation, the investigation summary. "I want you to know that your reinstatement is not contingent on any finding. It's administrative correction of an action that should never have been taken." "I appreciate that," Evelyn said. "I also want to be direct." Toll sat, gestured for Evelyn to do the same. "The investigation is going to surface things that make this institution look bad. Some of that is about Mercer. Some of it is about the administration. Some of it is going to be about systemic failures and how complaints were handled. All of it is true, and all of it needs to be addressed." She held Evelyn's gaze. "I'd like your input, not because you're obligated to give it, but because you understand this floor and this institution in a way that a new interim director doesn't." "My input on what specifically?" "The complaint intake process, the whistleblower protections, the relationship between clinical staff and administrative decision-making when a complaint involves an external actor with institutional connections." Toll paused. "What broke here wasn't just 2 people making bad choices. It was a structure that let them make those choices without consequence for long enough that it became normal." Evelyn looked at her steadily. "That's accurate." "So what does the structure look like when it works?" It was a real question, not a performance of one. Evelyn thought about it the way she thought about clinical problems. Not from the outcome backward, but from the failure point forward, identifying where the system diverged from its intended function and why. Independent intake, she said. Complaints against individuals with institutional relationships go outside the hospital's HR system to an independent reviewer, not affiliated with the board, not subject to board pressure. She paused. And documentation, real documentation, with timestamps verified by system metadata, not manual entry. If the November incident had been logged in real time with tamper-evident records, the backdating wouldn't have been possible. Tull was writing. Go on. They talked for 40 minutes. At the end, Tull set her pen down and said, I'm going to recommend to the board that you lead the working group on the new protocols. Evelyn looked at her. I'm a bedside nurse? Yes, that's why I'm recommending you. Tull held her gaze. The people who design accountability systems should be the ones who understand what it costs when they fail. Evelyn said nothing for a moment. Outside the window, the city she'd been looking at for 14 months went about its afternoon. Ordinary, imperfect, full of the specific density of lives being lived without knowledge of each other's particulars. I'll think about it, she said. That's all I'm asking. She left the office and took the stairs down, because the elevator was slow and she was thinking, and thinking was easier in motion. On the second-floor landing, she stopped and looked at her phone, which had buzzed while she was in Tull's office. Tran, formal charges filed for Mercer. Coercion of a protected complaint witness, Greer, obstruction, abuse of official capacity. 3 counts. Arraignment tomorrow morning. And below it, from a different number. The unknown number that had sent her the screenshot. Told you he didn't withdraw it. DF. She looked at those initials for a moment, then looked at the stairwell, the institutional concrete and fluorescent light of a building she'd walked through 100 times. DF Dottie. Farwell, who had said document what you see in a hallway 11 days ago and had apparently kept doing exactly that, had kept watching, had kept files, had found the 2-year-old complaint in the system before anyone else thought to look for it, and had sent it to Evelyn through an anonymous route so that it would surface through the federal channel rather than through an internal one that could be managed. 11 years in this hospital, Dottie knew exactly where things were buried. Evelyn put the phone in her pocket and went back down the stairs, and on the 3rd floor through the stairwell door, she could hear the unit. The monitors, the call bell, someone asking a question about a chart, the ordinary accumulated sound of a floor that needed nursing, and she pushed the door open and went back to work. And in the federal courthouse downtown, in the filing system that would now permanently carry his name, Brock Mercer's case number sat in the database alongside Leon Greer's original complaint, reinstated in full, with a notation that the withdrawal had been coerced and the specific legal language that would follow him from this day forward, not as an allegation, not as a review, but as a charge. 3 of them. Filed, stamped, and irrevocable. The same system he'd used for 19 years to make things disappear had just done the opposite, and there was no version of what came next in which he walked away from it. What nobody in the federal building knew yet, what Tran would discover when she opened the case file server at 6 a.m. the following morning, was that Mercer's attorney had submitted, as part of the cooperation disclosure, a secondary document that none of them had known to look for, a log. Handwritten, 9 pages, dating back 4 years. Names, dates, complaint numbers, outcomes. Mercer had kept records of every suppression, not out of guilt, out of protection. The instinct of a man who understood leverage and wanted leverage over the institution that accommodated him, in case the day ever came when the accommodation stopped. That day had come, and the log he'd kept to protect himself had just become the most comprehensive evidence of systematic misconduct that the Federal Labor Conduct Office had received in 7 years. Tran opened the case file server at 6:03 a.m. and found the log already flagged by her night team. 9 handwritten pages, scanned and uploaded by Mercer's attorney at 11:47 p.m. as part of the cooperation disclosure package, time-stamped and cataloged before anyone on the day shift had come in. She read it twice, made coffee, read it a 3rd time, and then called Dobbins. He kept names, she said when he answered. A pause. How many? 31 entries over 4 years. Names, dates, complaint reference numbers, and in some cases the specific method of resolution. Direct coercion, institutional pressure applied through Lofton, Cases routed through Voss's desk with a note indicating desired outcome. She turned a page. He wrote it like an insurance policy. Every entry has enough detail to verify against the hospital's own records. Dobbins was quiet for a moment. That's not a pattern. That's an operation. Yes, Tran said. It is. She hung up and looked at the window. Caldwell City was doing its early morning thing. Gray light, the refinery towers catching it, the particular flat quiet of a city not yet fully awake. 31 entries. 31 people who had tried to report something and been systematically redirected back into silence by a structure that had decided silence was the more convenient outcome. Some of those complaints were against Mercer directly. Some were against other officers who Mercer had connections to, favors owed, debts to collect. The log wasn't just evidence of his own misconduct, it was a map. She forwarded the scan to Deputy Director Varga with a single line. The scope has expanded. We need to talk before the arraignment. What? Brock Mercer's arraignment was at 9 a.m. in the Federal District Courthouse on Caldwell's Civic Center block, a building that smelled like recycled air and document storage, and the specific institutional weight of a place where things became official. He arrived with his attorney, a federal defense specialist named Hartwell, who had the practiced neutrality of someone paid to keep emotion out of rooms, and was processed through the security checkpoint and into the courtroom with the particular experience of a man in a strange country whose language he thought he spoke until he didn't. He had been in courtrooms before, as an officer, as a witness, as the institutional presence of the department behind a prosecution. He had never been the one at the defense table. The charges were read. 3 counts, as filed. His attorney entered a not guilty plea on his behalf, which Hartwell had explained was procedural and not a statement about the evidence. The judge set conditions of release. No contact with witnesses or complainants. Surrender of passport. No law enforcement duties of any kind. The room was not full. Arraignments rarely were, and this one wasn't a spectacle yet, though it would become one once the press release circulated and the 9-page log became part of the public record. But there were people in the gallery. 2 women Brock didn't recognize who turned out to be complainants from the log, there with a victim advocate from FMERD, a reporter from the Courier taking notes by hand, and in the back row in civilian clothes, Leon Greer, discharged from Hargrove Regional that morning on medical clearance, still moving carefully, still breathing with the deliberate attention of a man whose lungs were healing, who had come because he wanted to see it happen in person, and had decided that wanting that was not something he needed to justify. Brock saw him on the way out. Their eyes met for less than 3 seconds. Leon held his gaze without moving, without expression, with the particular stillness of a man who had made a decision 2 years ago that he'd regretted and had spent the interim carrying that regret, and who was now watching the consequence of a different decision arrive in real time. He didn't look satisfied. He didn't look vindicated. He looked like a person for whom something that had been wrong for a long time was in the process of becoming less wrong, which was a more complicated feeling than satisfaction and more honest. Brock looked away first. The 9-page log became public record at 2 p.m. that afternoon when FMERD filed it as supplemental evidence in the federal case. By 3, the Courier had a piece online. By 5, the regional affiliates were running it. By 7 p.m., the National Wire had picked it up with the specific language that national wires use when a local story has crossed the threshold into something with broader implication. Federal investigation at Caldwell City Hospital reveals systematic suppression of misconduct complaints spanning 4 years and involving at least 31 individuals. 31. That number traveled fast. It traveled the way numbers do when they're large enough to be specific, but not so large they become abstract. 31 was a number people could hold, could put faces on, could understand as a roster of people who had tried to do the right thing and been turned back. The Caldwell City Police Department issued a statement at 6 p.m., saying it was conducting an internal review of all cases in which Officer Mercer had been a complainant or arresting officer going back 5 years. The statement did not use the word misconduct. It used the word review 11 times, which was its own kind of statement. At 7:15, the precinct captain who had told Brock to sit tight and not talk to anyone resigned his position, citing personal reasons, in a letter that was 2 sentences long. The union representative who had stood silent in the parking lot during the badge and weapons surrender resigned from the union oversight committee the same evening. The system that had accommodated Brock Mercer for 19 years was not dismantling itself out of principle. It was doing what systems do when the ground shifts, identifying the pieces that were most visibly attached to the failure and separating from them as fast as possible. That was not justice. It was a start. Pop. The working group met for the first time in the third-floor conference room at Hargrove Regional on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the arraignment. 8 people around the table: Evelyn, Dottie, Dr. Salazar, 2 nurses from the overnight rotation who had submitted written accounts of the institutional atmosphere under Putnam's administration, Cassandra Toll, the hospital's new legal compliance officer, and a representative from FMERD named Specialist Reyes, the same quiet woman from the extended stay meeting who had said almost nothing and read everything. The working group's mandate, per the Federal Oversight Agreement, was to design a complaint intake and documentation system that could not be administratively captured, one in which a complaint against a person with institutional connections went through an independent verification channel before it touched any part of the hospital's internal structure. Evelyn had spent the 3 weeks between the arraignment and the first meeting writing 11 pages of notes. Not a proposal, not a formal document, just observations, written the way she wrote patient assessments, sequentially and without editorializing, tracking where the failure points had been and what a functional alternative might look like at each one. She'd been awake at 5 a.m. most mornings doing it, because the clinical part of her brain, the part trained to see system failures in terms of pathway breakdowns rather than individual error, wouldn't let it go. She put the 11 pages on the table at the start of the meeting and said, "This is what I have. It's rough." Salazar picked up the top sheet, read the first page. "It's not rough," he said. "It's a starting point. It's more than that." He looked up at her across the table. "The November incident. The dosing error I should have backed in writing." He set the page down. "I went back and pulled my charting from that shift. I wrote discussed with staff and nothing else. I had enough to document a clinical disagreement and a correct outcome, and I wrote 2 words. "You were busy," Evelyn said. "That's not—" He stopped. "Don't let me off easy." She looked at him steadily. "You're here now. That's the point of this table." He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded and picked the paper back up. They worked for 2 hours. The conversation was not smooth. Dottie and one of the overnight nurses disagreed sharply about the complaint verification timeline, and Reyes interrupted twice to flag places where the proposed language had legal vulnerabilities that would need to be addressed before the system could be formally adopted. And Toll had to redirect the conversation 3 times when it started moving toward process grievances instead of structural design. It was the friction of people who cared about getting it right and had different ideas about what right meant, and that friction was productive in the way that friction between actual materials is productive, generating heat, yes, but also revealing the true shape of things. By the end, they had a framework. Not a finished system. 4 more meetings, probably, before it was ready for the federal compliance review. But a framework with teeth. Independent intake, tamper-evident documentation, mandatory timeline verification, a direct escalation path to federal monitoring for complaints involving personnel with board connections. Reyes, gathering her materials at the end, said, "This is the most functional first draft intake framework I've seen from an institutional working group, and I've seen a lot of them." Dottie said, "Is that a compliment or a commentary on other institutions?" "Both," Reyes said. "But..." Leon Greer came back to Hargrove Regional 6 weeks after his discharge for a follow-up respiratory assessment. His lungs were clearing, the blast damage resolving along the slower timeline that blast injuries always required, which meant months, not weeks, and the particular patience of a man relearning to breathe without compensation. He passed through the 3rd floor on his way out and stopped at the nurses' station. Evelyn was there, charting. "Clear enough to go back to light duty in 2 months," he said. "That's what they're saying." "2 months is fast," she said. "Don't rush it." "I won't." He stood there for a moment, both of them in the quiet of a floor between crises. "I heard about the working group. It's ongoing. Dottie told me about the intake redesign, the independent verification." He looked at her. If that had existed 2 years ago, yeah, she said, it would have. He was quiet for a moment. There was something in his expression that had been working its way toward the surface for weeks. Not the formal relief of a witness whose account had been vindicated, but something more personal and less resolved. The feeling of a man who had done the wrong thing for what felt like a survivable reason and then lived in the shadow of that for 2 years. I should have held the complaint, he said. She set her pen down. You were protecting your brother. I was protecting myself from having to protect my brother. There's a difference. He looked at her. You didn't have anyone to protect. You just held. I had less to lose, she said. That's not the same as being braver. He considered that. Maybe not, but it counts for something. What counts is that you gave the statement when it mattered, she said. That's what's in the record. That's what's in the case. He nodded slowly. Then before he left, my crew chief wants to know if you'd consider coming to talk to the firehouse about the exposure protocol, the CDMB thing. He said they still have the old MSDS. Tell him to update it first, she said. Then yes. He almost smiled. Yeah, he figured you'd say that. Brock Mercer's trial concluded 4 months after the arraignment, at the end of a process that was less dramatic than the events that had preceded it, which was accurate to how trials actually worked. The drama was in the events, and the trial was the accounting. Hartwell mounted a defense that challenged the coercion characterization and disputed the institutional coordination, but the 9-page log was what it was, and Leon Greer's testimony was what it was, and the metadata on Pamela Voss's backdated file entries was what it was, and none of those things were susceptible to reframing. Guilty on all 3 counts. The sentencing came 6 weeks later, 3 years federal custody, 5 years probation, permanent revocation of law enforcement certification. No badge, ever again. The pension he'd accumulated over 19 years was subject to forfeiture proceedings under the public corruption statutes, which meant that the financial architecture he'd built, the retirement plan, the union protections, the institutional credibility, was being systematically dismantled in the same federal system he'd spent his career operating adjacent to. Pamela Voss accepted a plea agreement on the obstruction referral. 2 years probation, permanent prohibition from healthcare administration. She would never hold an HR position in a medical institution again. She issued a public statement that used the word regret 4 times and the word accountability once in the last sentence, which told you something about the ordering of her priorities. Gerald Putnam's federal obstruction case was still pending at sentencing, but the civil liability exposure from the manufactured HR file had already resulted in a settlement with Evelyn that he and the hospital's insurance carrier had quietly negotiated in the 3rd month of the investigation, the terms of which were confidential, but which Tran, in a message to Evelyn the day it was signed, described only as appropriate. Craig Lofton resigned from the hospital board as required. His cooperation had reduced his personal legal exposure, but had not eliminated it. The federal investigation into his role in routing complaint suppression through his board access was ongoing, and his attorneys had told him clearly that the cooperation credit was the only thing standing between him and the more serious end of the charging range. He had spent 30 years being one relationship removed from consequences. The distance had collapsed. The new emergency wing at Hargrove Regional opened 8 months after the explosion. Not a renovation, a real expansion, funded partly by the settlement and partly by a federal infrastructure grant that the hospital's new administration had applied for under Tull's direction. The wing had updated treatment bays, a properly equipped MCI staging area, and a complaint documentation terminal in the nursing hub that connected directly to the independent intake system the working group had spent 3 months building. On the wall beside that terminal, framed simply, was the new patient safety charter, a 1-page document that listed the rights of clinical staff to report misconduct without institutional retaliation and the specific protections and escalation pathways available to them. At the bottom, it said, "Adopted following the Hargrove Regional Accountability Review, by recommendation of the Clinical Ethics and Safety Working Group." There was no name attached. Evelyn had specifically asked for no name. Tull had pushed back on that mildly, and Evelyn had said, "The point isn't who wrote it, the point is that it works. People should know. People who need to know, Evelyn said. Let the document do the job. The opening ceremony was a Thursday afternoon, low-key by design. Tull had learned from the working group that the nursing staff had a deep institutional allergy to events that felt like they were about optics. There were maybe 30 people in the new wing's central bay, staff from multiple floors. Colonel Foss, who had driven 3 hours and stood in the back without drawing attention to himself. Leon Greer, who was on full active duty now and stood beside his crew chief near the door. Harriet Doyle, who had been board chair for 20 years and looked like someone who had recently been through something and was deciding what to do with it. Tull said a few words. Then she said, "I want to give the floor to someone who understands this space better than I do." Evelyn had not prepared a speech. She had thought about it and decided that preparation would make her want to make it good rather than true, and good and true were not always the same thing. She stood in the new bay and looked at the people in it, the nurses she'd worked beside for 14 months, the ones who had looked away in the hallway, and the ones who had said welcome back, and the ones who hadn't said anything but had shown up to every working group meeting without being asked twice. Dottie, in the second row, with the expression of someone who had no interest in being moved by this, and was failing at it. Salazar near the supply cart, arms crossed, watching. She looked at all of them and thought about the cardboard box in her car trunk with the landscape print still inside it because she hadn't yet put it back up, had been meaning to and kept not getting around to it, which was either avoidance or the simple accumulation of busy days. She thought about a hallway with papers on the floor and a man who laughed as he walked away and the specific temperature of the decision she'd made in the following seconds to document what had happened instead of absorbing it. "This wing is for the patients," she said. "That's first. That's always first." She paused. "But it's also for the people who work in it. And what I want them to know, what I want anyone who stands at that terminal and thinks about whether it's worth it, is that the system we built works because people in this building refused to let it not work. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just, they kept showing up, they kept documenting, they kept saying what they saw." Another pause. "You don't need authority to do that. You need to decide the truth is worth the trouble." The room was quiet. Then Dottie, who genuinely had no patience for ceremony, said, "Can we go see the new bays now?" Someone laughed. Then several people laughed. The tension released in the particular way it releases when a room full of people who have been through something together find the same moment funny, and the laughter was real and a little ragged and entirely human. Evelyn smiled. Small, genuine, the kind that came without planning. She went to see the new bays. But that evening she drove home the long way, along the arterial that ran past the refinery corridor and the eastern neighborhoods that were still, 8 months later, carrying the physical evidence of the explosion. A cleared lot where a section of fence had been, new siding on a row of houses that had taken debris. Caldwell City absorbing what had happened to it and continuing, because cities did that, because there was no alternative to continuing. She had the landscape print in the passenger seat, had finally taken it out of the box that afternoon, on an impulse she didn't analyze. She was going to put it back on her locker shelf, which was the most modest possible act of reclamation, and that modesty felt right. There was a voicemail on her phone from Foss, she'd listened to it at home, and a text from Tran that said, "Sentencing coverage is running nationally. You've seen it?" She typed back, "Not yet? Good?" Tran, "Appropriate." His word. "I figure that's yours too." She thought about that. Appropriate. 3 years, 5 probation, no badge. A 9-page log that was now permanent federal evidence. 31 names in a file that had been closed and were now open and were being reviewed one by a team that had been working through them for 5 months. 6 of those 31 had already received formal findings in their favor. The rest were in process. Not perfect, not clean. The institution had accommodated Mercer for 19 years, and that accommodation had roots she hadn't fully mapped and probably wouldn't, because the full archaeology of a corrupt system was rarely available to the people it had harmed. Some of those roots were still there, dormant, waiting for a new set of conditions to become active. That was the truth about systems. They didn't fix themselves permanently. They required ongoing maintenance in the way that anything worth maintaining did. She knew that. She'd known that from the beginning, which was why she'd kept the documentation, why she'd built the intake framework with tamper-evident records, why she'd said yes to the working group when it would have been easier to say no. Not because she believed in permanent solutions, because she believed in structures that made the wrong thing harder and the right thing possible. She pulled into her street and parked and sat for a moment with the engine off and the landscape print on the seat beside her and the quiet of the evening coming through the windows. Ordinary evening. Work tomorrow. Patients who needed nursing and a floor that needed staffing and a working group that had its fourth meeting next week, and Leon Greer's crew chief who needed someone to come talk to his firehouse about the right MSDS for the right compounds. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the specific weight of a life that had work in it that mattered, which was not a small thing and never had been, even when it was invisible, even when someone stood over scattered papers in a hallway and laughed. Especially then. She got out of the car with the landscape print under her arm and went inside. The people who had been certain she was powerless had been wrong about what power looked like. That was the only lesson that mattered, and it wasn't complicated, and it didn't require ceremony. It just required that you know it and hold it and refuse quietly, persistently, at whatever cost, to let anyone take it from you. She'd known it all along.